The Oregon Trail, which eventually led all the way to the Willamette Valley in the Pacific Northwest, was originally used by fur traders and trappers, mountain men, starting in the 18 teens for about the next 20 years or so. It was 1836 when the first immigrant wagon train headed west toward the Oregon Territory used this route. The first couple of times this was done, they had some of those old mountain men as guides. So first time through 1836, they cleared a path wide enough for wagons to travel on. And then afterward, more people started coming until by about 10 years later, 1846, that was the height of the travel on the trail. Between 1840 and 1860, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 settlers or settlers to be traveled along the Oregon Trail, and they all passed right through the northern plains. Now, in that same time period, that 20-year period, there were 362 of those travelers killed in conflict with Indians. So that's 0.001%. And in that same time, there were more than 460 Indians killed, which, in addition to being numerically slightly higher, proportionally, it was much higher, because there were nowhere near 300,000 or 400,000 Native Americans living along that route. So actually, the Oregon Trail ultimately was more dangerous for Indians than it was for the settlers. But still, 0.001%. That doesn't really fit in with sort of the legend, the popular memory, pop culture representations of the dangers of the Oregon Trail. In fact, if you ever played the old Oregon Trail computer game, you're aware that it wasn't Indians you had to worry about so much. In fact, for a lot of Indians in the Northern Plains, this huge influx of settlers actually provided some business opportunities for trade. These new folks passing through had lots of interesting things, and they needed things like, for example, food, perhaps, sometimes a little bit of guidance. So there was the chance to get trade goods, and there was also, admittedly, the opportunity that with all these people passing through with all that livestock, why, here and there, some of them might just be picked off and wind up feeding the village. There were, however, some serious minuses for the Indians with this whole Oregon Trail business. For one thing, the area that these immigrants were passing through it was part of the hunting area of most of these tribes. It's where a lot of the buffalo could be found, as well as other game, antelope, and etc. So just imagine what's going to happen if you've got 300,000 or 400,000 people and their animals passing right through your backyard like that. You're going to have a couple of problems. Number one, they're going to be scaring off a lot of that game. Number two, what they don't scare off, they're going to be killing and eating. So that's going to put a serious dent in your menu, really. And the fact is, as I mentioned just now, there was also a lot of trading going on. Sometimes that trading included meat and furs being given on the part of the Indians to the settlers to get those trade goods, and that contributed to the overhunting and the thinning out of the various herds on which the tribes relied. Also, all of these people passing through and making campfires every night required fuel. Well, they didn't bring their kerosene with them. They found their fuel where they could. And a lot of times there was no fuel to be found as they're going through the northern plains, and they had to use actually buffalo chips. Buffalo droppings is combustible, and so that substituted for wood when wood couldn't be found. But wood's always preferred, which meant that the few wooded areas in that region that were in existence were very quickly pretty much wiped out by these settlers for firewood and for other things. And that's going to be a problem for the local tribes who rely on that for their own fires as well as for the teepee poles that they need and various other things. These and various other issues led the U.S. government to seek a treaty with the tribes of the Great Plains, in large part to ensure the continued safety of the travelers along the Oregon Trail. I mean, it's one thing to say, only 300 and some people were killed by Indians in 20 years. And that's a really, really small number comparatively, but that doesn't help you if one of them's you or your family members. And the same thing on the side of the Indians. So this big treaty meeting was held at this newly constructed fort in what is now Wyoming, Fort Laramie. And several tribes were invited. 8 tribes showed up. The Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara, the Crow, and the Shoshone. The Comanche and Kiowa were invited, even though this is well north of their territory, although it's actually not that far from the ancestral homeland of both of them. But they were invited because all these agreements were meant to extend into the South as well. However, they didn't come because, well, they had just had that really bad smallpox outbreak, and the Comanches were still kind of ticked off about not getting their boundaries respected, and so they didn't trust the government, and they didn't come. The other tribes, however, did, and this was a treaty that was extremely important. It's one of the most important Indian treaties of the 19th century, and remember this one. Remember this one because we'll be talking about this even when we get into the 21st century. All right. Well, here's the agreement that was made. The various tribes guaranteed safe passage of settlers heading westward across their lands. Now, in return for the inconvenience that this was causing the Indians, particularly where their hunting was concerned, the U.S. government agreed to give each of the tribes what are called annuities, which is a certain amount of money and or goods that were to be delivered each year. So that's part of the treaty. And this, like I said, this helps make up for the dent in their hunting that all this traffic is going to cause. Also, the U.S. government mapped out these various areas you can see here in this map in which they basically assigned geographic territory to each tribe, pretty well in keeping with where their own territory actually was. Although you'll remember, territorial lines with native peoples were not something that were really solid and fixed, the sort of thing you could draw on a map. They kind of shifted and sometimes, in fact, frequently overlapped. Remember, there are certain areas that the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho all use. But the government laid this out so as to say, all right, here's the Crow country, no country like the Crow country, and here is the Pawnee, here is the Cheyenne, and so forth, and here the orange area, that was the area assigned in this treaty to the Great Sioux Nation, This is not the area that they control today, but most of their reservations today can be found within the areas that were mapped out right here. In return, also, the Indians were going to allow not only settlers to pass through, but allow the U.S. government to build forts along that trail and station soldiers there just in case, just to make sure the settlers were safe. So they were given permission to do that. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, in fact, was pretty effective for a while, and in fact, it ensured that the northern plains remained pretty peaceful for the rest of the 1850s, with one minor exception, which we'll look at in a little bit. But first, let's go back to Texas. In 1854, the legislature of Texas, which by that time was a state, no longer an independent republic, the legislature approved funding to provide the land for 3 reservations in Texas in the upper Brazos country, which we've talked about a couple of times already. And these reservations were going to be for the various tribes that were in Texas, the Caddo, the Karankawa, the Tonkawa, and the Comanches, if they could convince them to come there. The Army built a Camp Cooper, which is like a small fort that was built to oversee those 3 reservations. The 2nd United States Cavalry was charged with setting up that camp and manning it. It was under the command, the regiment was under the command of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston. And once the camp was established and built, it was commanded by Captain Robert E. Lee. So, to test your Civil War knowledge, which of those 2 was the highest-ranking field general in command during of the Confederate Army during the Civil War? If you said both of them, you were correct, because Albert Sidney Johnston was in command of the western part of the Confederate Army at the very beginning of the Civil War, and then he was killed. And then later, Robert E. Lee took over the Army of Northern Virginia. So that's 2 future Confederate luminaries that at this point are there in Texas. In fact, Albert Sidney Johnston had a connection to Texas for a long time. He had been there during the Texas Revolution, and in the administration of Texas President Mirabeau Lamar, he had been the Secretary of War. These reservations were opened up in 1855, and the following year, 1856, Buffalo Hump and his Penateka band of Comanches surrendered and agreed to come in and confine themselves to this reservation. However, this did not go over well with the local people there in Texas who lived in the region near the reservation, who still had some animosity toward that about that great raid 16 years earlier. And in fact, an impromptu militia of a couple of hundred Texans gathered up together and were threatening to come and attack the reservation. Finally, the U.S. government decided that this whole thing wasn't going to work, and they ordered the Comanches under Buffalo Hump to be removed to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. So they were sent up there. Camp Cooper was abandoned. That whole idea kind of fell apart. And Buffalo Hump remained in Oklahoma for the rest of his life, which was about 10, 11 more years. He finally passed away in 1870 when he would have been in his 70s and is buried at Fort Sill. In fact, as we'll be seeing, quite a few famous leaders of the tribes of the Great Plains and other areas are buried at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Now let's take a look at that one minor blip on the peace in the 1850s brought about by the Fort Laramie Treaty that I mentioned a moment ago. In the spring of 1856, a Southern Cheyenne, was wounded by some settlers. In retaliation, that summer, the Cheyenne raided and attacked some settlers, and there were a few, like 3 or 4 other raids where I don't think anyone was killed, but there was property stolen and damaged. There may have been some people wounded. Maybe there were 1 or 2 people killed. Whatever the result, the government decided that they needed to definitely have a show of force to sort of show the Cheyenne and the other tribes what would happen if they violated that treaty. So the following spring, after summer into the early fall, these several raids, the following spring, a force of about 400 U.S. cavalry was sent on a punitive expedition against the Cheyenne. So basically, they were wandering around the prairie in Kansas looking for Cheyenne Indians, and it took them a while to find any. They finally did that summer on July the 29th at a place called Solomon Fork in Kansas. There were about 300 Cheyenne warriors, and I think there were some Arapaho with them that were there, and the cavalry came upon them and charged at them. The Cheyenne had believed they had a medicine man who had told them that if they waved their hands, the bullets wouldn't hurt them, and so they just sort of stood there very coolly, waving their hands, while the cavalry charged at them and started firing, and then some of them got shot, and so they scattered. After they scattered, the cavalry wasn't able to catch up with them again because the Cheyenne had fresh horses, and the cavalry horses had just basically they just brought them there on a trek from I think Nebraska, so they were worn out. So that was pretty well the end of that engagement. The result was 9 Cheyenne warriors were killed and several were wounded. 2 American soldiers were killed, and 8 were wounded. The plan was to track down those Cheyenne and attack them again, but the cavalry unit got word that instead they were to report to Utah, where they had to go fight some Mormons, because that was going on at the time. So that was pretty well the end of this. Well, I said it's a minor blip. If you're one of the 9 Cheyennes who got killed, or one of the 2 Americans who got killed, it was a pretty major blip to you. So that's to be taken in context and relatively. Okay, so the Battle of Solomon Fork was significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, this was the very first time ever that the Cheyenne had engaged in battle on the field with American troops. Now, in previous years, before the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, Cheyenne had joined their Lakota allies in some raids attacking some settlers. But so far as actually fighting against the U.S. Army, this was the first time. Spoiler alert, won't be the last time. Another thing about this battle that's interesting is among those 8 people who were wounded, one of them was a lieutenant named James Ewell Brown Stewart, or J.E.B., or Jeb Stewart, as he was known. So here he is on the left as he looked at that time in 1857, and on the right as he looked a few years later. Beards came into vogue, by the way. A lot of these folks, like we just looked at Robert E. Lee, he didn't have a beard. Abraham Lincoln didn't have a beard. Jeb Stuart had quite the beard by the 1860s when he was a major Confederate cavalry general serving under Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. At the Battle of Solomon Fork, he was shot in the chest, but survived. to fight in the Civil War, be a major figure, although he got shot again in 1864 during the war and did not survive. But that's really for a different class. Well, I said that after the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, there was peace in the region for the rest of the decade, other than that small skirmish at Solomon Fort. So here's what brought that peace to an end at the end of the decade, and this should come as no surprise when gold gets discovered. It's bad news for the Indians in the area, and in fact, gold was discovered at Pikes Peak in what is now Colorado, but at that time was part of Kansas territory, and was right smack dab in the middle of that area that the Treaty of 1851 had designated as Cheyenne and Arapaho territory. Now, there were settlers living outside the area, but when gold gets discovered, you know what's going to happen. People are going to come pouring in, and there's just no stopping them, and they come in large numbers, and that starts to cause some major friction with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And as that friction starts to mount, the U.S. government realizes that this could have a bad ending, and so in an effort to cut that off, the government enters into negotiations, or tries to enter into negotiations with the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho to get them to reconsider their deal from 1851. Most of the Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders, however, were not interested in any such negotiation. So when the negotiations were held at Fort Wise, there were 6 Southern Cheyenne leaders and 4 Southern Arapaho leaders that showed up. These are band leaders. The vast majority of Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho did not, nor did their leadership, but this handful did. The most prominent of the Cheyenne who showed up was Black Kettle, and among the Arapaho, most prominent was Little Raven. So they met with the U.S. government representatives and agreed that they would confine themselves to an area near Sand Creek that was just across the Arkansas River from Fort Wise. Now, what the treaty actually said was that they were agreeing to give up all the lands that had been assigned them in the Treaty of 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty, and that's all that area in pink there on this map. And in return, that they were going to accept this small area in the purple there by Fort Wise. Well, the other Cheyenne and Arapaho, who had not sent representatives to this, had the view, which was actually a correct view, that those 10 chiefs who did show up didn't represent everybody. They only represented their own villages. And so anything they agreed to wasn't binding on everybody else. The U.S. government, however, looked at it that, and this is the way that the U.S. government has worked with Indians and how the colonial European powers worked with them before that. Well, we got somebody to sign, so that counts for all of you, essentially. So the U.S. government was saying that any Arapaho and Cheyenne outside of that purple area on the map were in violation of this treaty, and that was an act of war. The other Cheyenne and Arapaho, most prominently the military society known as the Dog Soldiers, basically said, so what? We are going to continue hunting in our traditional areas, And any of your people, that is miners or settlers, who show up in our area, we won't be held responsible for what we do to them. So, Black Kettle, Little Raven, and their people went to Sand Creek as they were asked to do, and their bands with them. But everyone else was still operating out of the larger area. So as you can imagine, this is setting things up for conflict, and conflict there will be. However, there's an even bigger conflict brewing by 1860, 1861. As you are no doubt well aware, that's 1861. That spring is when the Civil War started. And when the Civil War started, that meant that all the U.S. troops stationed in Colorado, or at least the vast majority of them, were withdrawn because they had to go fight Confederates. And that left the people living in the area, many of whom had joined the Colorado militias that were also being mobilized to go fight the Confederates. It left them feeling in a very untenable and unprotected situation. But that didn't stop them from trying to find more gold or stake out more land. So, yes, the Civil War is coming, but it's going to get pretty violent here in eastern Colorado as well. In fact, the Civil War, which we think of in terms of the blue and the gray, had a really large impact on Indian country west of the Mississippi in general. So in our next section, we'll be looking at the various things that happened with the tribes of the plains during the Civil War.